All right, let's dive deep into the transatlantic slave trade and abolition. Pretty heavy stuff. I know you're probably here because you want to really get a handle on it, but let's be honest. There's just so much information out there, it can be, well, a little overwhelming to say the least. So we've got two really fascinating sources we're going to use to kind of break it all down. First up, a historical overview of slavery from the Hampshire Record Office. Over in the UK, we'll just call that the Hampshire source for simplicity's sake. And then we'll be looking at a report from the Equal Justice Initiative in the US. The EJI report, if you will.
You know, it's great. Each source brings its own unique flavor to the table. The Hampshire one is packed with these really specific stories and examples, all rooted in, local history. While the EJI report, that takes a much broader approach, using hard data and statistics to paint a picture of slavery's impact across the U.S.
Exactly. So by kind of weaving these two together, we're aiming for a more nuanced and well-rounded picture, And one thing that really grabbed me was how the Hampshire source takes us way back in time, like long before the whole transatlantic slave trade even kicked off. They talk about the Romans using slaves right here in Britain, and then medieval slavery, even the Barbary Coast slave trade, where pirates were snatching Europeans and selling them into slavery in North Africa.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that slavery's unfortunately been a recurring theme throughout human history, not just limited to, one specific time or place.
It's true, and get this, they even have this picture of a restraining device, likely used on those Barbary Coast slaves. Just, chilling to look at. But here's where things get really interesting. The EJI report makes this point that race-based hereditary slavery, where people are born into slavery and there's no escape, that was actually pretty uncommon before the 15th century. So the big question is what changed? What caused this transatlantic slave trade to just explode?
Well, the EJI report really hammers home the economic factors at play. Europe's demand for sugar, it was skyrocketing. But problem was, the indigenous populations in the Americas, the ones Europeans had initially forced into labor, they were being wiped out by disease and overwork, creating this huge labor vacuum that, Europeans needed to fill somehow.
So they turned to Africa, and that's how this horrible triangular trade system was born. It's almost hard to wrap your head around the scale of it. European ships sailing to Africa, trading manufactured goods for human beings, then transporting those enslaved people to the Americas to work on plantations, and finally returning to Europe loaded with sugar, tobacco, you name it.
It's truly mind-boggling, and to really understand the human cost, the Hampshire source, it zeroes in on one particular plantation, Nuts River in Jamaica. They have these incredibly detailed records listing the enslaved people by name, their births, deaths, even causes of death, which it just hits you hard that these were real individuals, not just numbers on a page.
It's true. There's one entry that just says dirt eating as the cause of death. Breaks your heart, really. And then you have the plantation owner, Sir Thomas Champney. His records detailing all the supplies he shipped over, clothing, tools, food, even medication makes you wonder. What was healthcare like for these enslaved people? Was it just another way to, control them, make sure they could keep working?
Definitely raises some tough questions about the power dynamics at work and how every aspect of plantation life revolved around squeezing out maximum profit.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't forget the horrifying journey across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, the EGI report, doesn't hold back on the brutality. Overcrowding, disease, lack of sanitation, physical and sexual abuse. They even describe how pregnant women, mothers with infants were treated.
Dehumanizing doesn't even begin to cover it. The EJI report uses Olaudah Equiano's account to really drive that home. He was an enslaved African who actually survived the Middle Passage, and he describes the stench, the sounds of suffering, the just, utter despair. He even talks about how sailors would rather throw leftover fish overboard than feed the starving people trapped below deck.
Yeah, just unimaginable cruelty. And then Equiano's description of families being ripped apart at slave auctions in Barbados, just gut-wrenching. He talks about brothers being separated, sold to different buyers, their cries.
His words, they're incredibly powerful, give us a glimpse into the emotional trauma inflicted by this system.
Yeah, it's hard to even process. And it's important to remember this wasn't just some far-off event. The Hampshire source points out that some enslaved Africans ended up in Hampshire. Right here in Britain, it shows how deeply connected this trade was to seemingly ordinary places.
It really underscores the global reach, how it touched lives across continents.
Absolutely now, once they arrived in the Americas, the experiences of those enslaved could vary wildly. The EJI report highlights a big difference in the racial demographics between North and South America and how that shaped the development of slavery in each region.
For instance, in South America and the Caribbean, the enslaved African population often outnumbered the European colonists, creating this constant fear of rebellion leading to harsher control measures. Whereas in North America, the larger European population meant uprisings. While they did happen, were less of an immediate threat.
So it wasn't just the type of work they were forced to do, but these power dynamics, the constant threat of violence that really defined their lives. And the EGI report even mentions how legal codes governing slavery differed, like the French Code Noir in Louisiana, which, while still upholding slavery, it did offer some very limited rights and protections to free people of color.
Shows how complex and adaptable this system of slavery was, even within its brutality. It morphed to fit different social and economic reality.
Exactly, and speaking of different contexts, the Hampshire source gives us an example from the British colony of Guyana, where enslaved Africans filled vastly different roles. Some worked as house servants, while others toiled in the fields.
And according to the Hampshire source, those who worked as domestic servants lived in constant fear of being demoted. To field work, imagine that, a hierarchy of suffering, created by the system itself.
Now, both sources touch on something I think many people might not realize, the role of the church in this whole slave trade business.
Yeah, the EJI report digs into how the Roman Catholic Church was deeply entwined with the trade, both supporting and profiting from it, while simultaneously baptizing enslaved people. They even mention pronouncements from Pope Nicholas V in the 15th century. That essentially, condoned slavery.
And if you think New England was somehow morally superior, think again. The EJI report reveals how New England actually made a killing off the slave trade. Even though it wasn't a major slaveholding region itself, they were involved through industries like rum, shipbuilding, textiles, you name it. Rhode Island, get this, was one of the 15 largest slave trading ports in the entire world.
Really drives home the point that the economic incentives driving slavery were global. They touch nearly every corner of the world in some way.
For sure, and the EJI report even includes examples of ads for enslaved people being sold right in New England newspapers, and there's one for an insurance company that specifically insured enslaved people. Just shows how embedded slavery was in the very fabric of the economy back then.
It's a sobering thought, forces us to look beyond individual acts of cruelty, to see the systems that enabled and profited from this trade.
Now let's shift gears a bit, talk about the path towards abolition. The Hampshire source really focuses on the movement in Britain, and what's fascinating is how central women were to this fight.
Absolutely. Women were right on the front lines, especially through religious groups like the Quakers. They organized boycotts, raised awareness, pushed for political change.
Yeah, the Hampshire source really highlights the work of Melusina Trench, an Irish abolitionist who traveled and wrote passionately against slavery. They even include a letter she wrote to Thomas Clarkson, another big name in the movement. And there's this interesting tidbit, they mentioned William Curtis. He was involved in the anti-slavery movement in Hampshire, and he actually lamented the lack of a strong female leader in their branch of the movement. Really underscores how vital women were to this whole fight.
They were instrumental, no doubt about it. Shifting public opinion, pushing for legislative action. They made it happen.
And while the Hampshire source focuses on Britain, it's key to remember abolition was a long and messy process, frankly. The EGI report points out that even after the slave trade was outlawed in the U.S. in 1808, slavery itself continued for decades.
Right, they talk about the apprenticeship system that replaced it, which, let's face it, was basically slavery with a different name. And even after the final abolition of slavery across the British Empire in 1838, the fight for genuine equality, that was far from over. It's really striking how both of these sources, they don't just focus on the horrors of the slave trade, but also on the just incredible resilience of those who were, enslaved.
Oh, absolutely. The EJI report details how they resisted in both big and small ways, running away, sabotaging work, holding on to their cultural traditions, even fighting back violently at times.
Like the Stono Rebellion, right? In South Carolina, 1739, the report describes how this group of enslaved Africans, they armed themselves and tried to escape to Spanish Florida. Tragically, it was brutally suppressed, but still, it really shows their courage, their determination to be free.
No doubt about it, and this resistance, it didn't stop. Even after the Transatlantic Slave Trade was officially over, the EJI report talks about the Underground Railroad. Enslaved people were still running away, seeking freedom in the North.
Constantly challenging the system that, tried to dehumanize them.
Their strength, their defiance, it's honestly inspiring. But even though slavery was officially abolished in the U.S. in 1865, the EGI report makes it clear that the fight for true equality, it wasn't over, not by a long shot.
Sadly not. The report goes on to detail the rise of Jim Crow laws down in the South, designed to, maintain white supremacy and restrict the rights of black people. It's like one form of oppression was just replaced by another.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see how the shadow of slavery continued to loom so large.
The report documents countless instances of lynching, racial terror, systemic disenfranchisement, all of which persisted well into the 20th century. Stark reminder of how deep the scars of this history run.
But amidst all this darkness, the EJI report also highlights the ongoing fight for racial justice, for equality.
It does. It talks about the civil rights movement, the dismantling of Jim Crow, and the continuing struggle to address, well, the systemic inequalities that still exist today.
And speaking of learning from this history, the Hampshire source actually offers some really thought-provoking ideas. They have these writing prompts for students to, engage more deeply with the material. One prompt asks students to consider the various ways enslaved Africans ended up in Hampshire, encouraging them to think about the connections between seemingly distant places.
I like that. This is a valuable exercise. Helps us understand how historical events, they ripple through time and space, connect us all in ways we might not expect.
Right. And another prompt asks students to analyze the language used in primary sources about slavery, which is so important because it reveals how language itself was used to justify, to perpetuate this system.
By examining how people in the past talked about slavery, we get a deeper understanding of how ingrained it was in their worldview. But it also challenges us to be more critical of the language we use today, to confront how racism and prejudice can still manifest in our words and actions.
Now, both the Hampshire source and the EJI report touch on the psychological impact of slavery, but they only kind of scratch the surface. And this is something I think we need to explore a bit further, don't you?
Absolutely. It's crucial to acknowledge that. The trauma inflicted by slavery, it didn't just vanish. With emancipation, it reverberated through generations, impacting families, communities, even our understanding of ourselves.
The EJI report, for example, talks about the deliberate dehumanization of enslaved people, seen as property, stripped of basic rights, subjected to constant violence and degradation.
Try to imagine the psychological impact of that. Being torn from your family, your culture, your language, constantly being told that you're inferior. The psychological scars, they run deep.
It's almost impossible to grasp the extent of that trauma. And while the Hampshire source doesn't explicitly address psychological trauma, it does highlight the ways in which enslaved people resisted, clung to their humanity.
It's remarkable, their resilience. Even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, they created families, practiced their religions, developed unique forms of cultural expression. It speaks to the enduring strength of the human spirit.
It really does, a testament to their will to survive, to preserve their sense of self. And the EJI report briefly mentions this concept, epigenetics. Have you heard of this?
Oh yeah, epigenetics explores how our experiences and environment can actually alter the way our genes work. And what's even more fascinating is that these changes can be passed down to future generations.
So you're saying the trauma of slavery could literally change the DNA of those who were enslaved. And those changes, they could still be affecting their descendants today.
Exactly. It's a relatively new area of study. But there's growing evidence to support it. For instance, studies have shown that descendants of Holocaust survivors, they have higher rates of stress and anxiety disorders, even if they never directly experienced the Holocaust themselves.
Wow. So the trauma of our ancestors could be influencing our health and well-being in the present.
It's a compelling possibility, one with profound implications for how we understand the lasting legacy of slavery.
And it raises some pretty big ethical questions too, right? If our genes can be impacted by the experiences of our ancestors, what does that mean for our sense of personal responsibility? And how does it change the way we approach issues like racial disparities and social justice?
Those are tough questions, complex questions,
yeah.
Ones that we as a society need to grapple with as we learn more about the interplay of genetics, environment, and human experience.
So I'd love to hear from you, the listener. What are your thoughts on this idea of epigenetic inheritance? Does it change how you view the legacy of slavery? Does it shift your perspective on the challenges we face as a society today? These are difficult questions, but they're worth pondering. I think it's pretty clear that just acknowledging the basic facts of the transatlantic slave trade, it's not enough. We need to understand the deeper consequences, the psychological and social ones that are still playing out today.
That's right. And these two sources, they give us some tools to start doing that. You remember those writing prompts in the Hampshire source? They encourage a different kind of thinking, a deeper engagement. It's not just about retelling the events, it's about wrestling with the complexity of it all.
Yeah, they push us to think for ourselves, which is so important.
And then there's the EJI report with its powerful mix of data and personal stories. It gives us this framework for understanding how slavery's legacy is. Well, it's woven into so many issues we're still dealing with. Mass incarceration, racial disparities in wealth and health, even the persistence of racial bias in our society.
It's like connecting the dots between then and now.
Exactly, and that brings us to you, the listener. What will you do with this knowledge? How will you use it to challenge injustice, to promote understanding, to work towards a more equitable future?
I think that's the real question we all have to ask ourselves. We can't just absorb this information and then go about our lives like nothing's changed. We have a responsibility to act, to engage, to make a difference.
And that can look different for everyone.
Right.
It might mean supporting organizations fighting against systemic racism. Maybe it's having those tough conversations with family and friends about race and privilege. Or maybe it's as simple as continuing to learn to educate yourself on these issues.
You know, the EJI report also mentions the power of visiting places like the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Those sites offer such a visceral experience. It can help you connect with this history on a much deeper level.
And it's crucial to remember that this isn't just about the past. It's about the present, about the future. Slavery's legacy is woven into the very fabric of our society. And it's up to all of us to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. The fight for justice, for equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It takes sustained effort, unwavering commitment, and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
And don't be overwhelmed by how big this task is. Every step we take, even the small ones, they move us closer to a world where everyone can truly thrive. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people, so many organizations working tirelessly for a better future. Find your people, join the movement, and let's make history together.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and inspired you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a more just world.